Hi, I'm David Waddell with the King County Art Hazards Project. And today we're down at the Mosher Community Arts Center in Burien, Washington. And as you can see in front of me, we have a bunch of ceramics pieces. This is a terrific studio where people can come and make ceramics. And what I want to talk about today are the colorants that are used in the ceramics. As you can see, most of these pieces here are colored, and what they use are glazes to make these colors. Glazes can either contain non-toxic materials or toxic materials. So how can you figure out if the glazes you've got contain toxic materials? Well, what you need to do is you need to dig around in the boxes where your glazes are and lift them up and read the labels. Sometimes they don't have labels, but if they do, quite often they will have health warnings. And what you want to look for is words like caution, health caution, or a California Proposition 65 warning that it contains a reproductive hazard. In this case, we found a small container. It's got a health caution label, and on the side we can read that it contains cadmium and lead, and soluble lead. Both cadmium and lead are neurotoxic compounds. Cadmium in particular is a very powerful carcinogen, can cause cancer, especially if breathed in a dust form. One of the things we urge people to do, especially if they have children doing pottery, is try to avoid lead and cadmium and other toxic heavy metal containing glazes. If you're going to work in ceramics, you're going to be working with clay. You have a couple options for how you can do that. One is you can work with dry clay and mix it up yourself. The problem with working with dry clay is you're going to generate a lot of dust, and that dust is going to contain crystalline silica. You don't want to inhale crystalline silica because eventually it can cause impairment of your lung function through and possibly silicosis, which can lead to a serious lung disease, maybe even lung cancer. One way to avoid breathing silica dust in is to get your clay pre-wetted, like in the block right here. Pre-wetted clay generates no dust until you finally end up using it. So at least in the initial process, you're not going to be inhaling any of that silica dust. Once you use the clay, however, and it dries out, at that point you've got the chance of there being new dust being generated after it's dried. So how do you avoid breathing that in? Well, you can wear respiratory protection, but the easiest way is to use a shop vac, like this one here, that has a HEPA filter, a high efficiency particulate filter on it. That will filter out that fine dust and keep it from getting resuspended up into the air where you could breathe it in again. After you use the HEPA filter shop vacuum, then you can go through with a mop and wet mop your floor to pick up the very last of that dust that may be down there that the vacuum couldn't get. This is a way to keep your studio clean and to keep that silica dust out of your lungs. So we've been talking about clay and trying to keep the clay dust under control. The next step after you get your clay together and you've thrown your pot is now you're thinking about glazing it. In the process of glazing it, we run through the same issues with trying to keep the dust down. Why are we concerned about the dust with glazes? Well, because many of the glazes contain potentially toxic heavy metals in them. The metals are the things that add the color. In the case of this particular glaze, the copper carbonate, it's beautiful blue-green color, but it's the copper dust that we are concerned about. Fortunately for people, copper is not particularly toxic, but for fish and other aquatic wildlife, copper is very, very toxic. So this is a compound where we want you to be careful about your own health by not breathing in the dust, but we're very concerned about what you do with any water that's contaminated with this copper glaze because it's in solution. And if you pour it down the drain, it's going to be going to either the sewage treatment plant or a storm drain where it can cause problems with any of the aquatic life that are downstream. So it's very important to know whether the glazes you're working with contain any toxic heavy metals in them. And if so, that you're very, very careful about how you handle them to protect yourself from breathing the dust that may be generated from working with them. And how you also handle them after you're done creating them or working with them. So you're not sending these toxic compounds down a drain where it can cause problems downstream. So I mentioned that you don't want to put toxic heavy metal glazes down the drain when they're wet. What do you do with them? If you can't pour them down the drain, how can you manage the rinse water that you've got when you're cleaning out your glaze buckets? What we'd like you to do is pour it into a 5-gallon pail, kind of like this one here, and just let it sit and let it evaporate that water away so those metal sludges can settle down in the bottom and start hardening up. They'll eventually get kind of like this one here, where you've got some rock hard glaze and clay mixed together down here. Once this gets filled up pretty well with that dried out glaze, you can deliver that to our household hazardous waste collection sites in King County, and we'd be happy to take that away from you and dispose of it properly. For some of these things, they may be okay to go into the solid waste stream, but we'd prefer that you just bring it over to our sites and we can make that decision for you. Most of your glazes are going to be non-toxic, but if they contain any of those toxic metals I talked about, we really want you to go through this process and evaporate the water away and concentrate those glazes down and bring it to us for disposal. So when you're working with glazes, how can you tell which ones should be of more concern to you than others? So which metals should we watch out for? There's a series of different metals that are of concern. Mercury and lead are two of the more famous ones. Cadmium is another one that we're very concerned about. In the room here with us, we have iron chromate and potassium dichromate. The chromium compounds, especially the chromate compounds, are known carcinogens, much like the cadmium compounds. These are things where it's not a question of whether or not they cause cancer. We even know what kinds of cancer you can get if you breathe these things in. The exposure limits for the chromates in particular in a workplace setting are set so low that it's essentially the equivalent of taking a grain of sand, cutting it into 10 pieces, pulverizing one of those tenths of a piece of grain of sand, and avoiding ever breathing that in over the course of a day at any point in time. That's how toxic this stuff is considered by OSHA. And so it indicates that you should really be careful when you're working with these materials. One way you can avoid getting exposed to these toxic dusts is to buy your glazes pre-mixed. Let somebody back at the manufacturing facility or distribution facility do the mixing at their location where hopefully they have good respiratory protection programs in place. And you're buying it already pre-mixed. There's no dust. It's in a liquid form. You still need to be careful about how you dispose of it, but at least this way you're reducing that risk of inhaling the toxin. So chromium is one to watch out for. Lead, cadmium, copper, zinc are all ones that are toxic to fish and that we don't want going down the drain. Another heavy metal that we're concerned about people working with is manganese. Manganese dioxide is a commonly used colorant. It's black. Gets some beautiful coloration once it's been heated. Manganese is an interesting one in that it's not necessarily, it doesn't cause cancer. It's not necessarily acutely toxic where it makes you very sick right off the bat. But long-term exposure to manganese dust can actually cause essentially Parkinson's disease. You have similar symptoms and it's just as tough to recover from those symptoms of quivering hands, neurological problems, trouble speaking, nodding of the head. All of these things come from manganese exposure. So this is another compound that we want you to be really careful with. As you're thinking about which glaze you want to work with, really think carefully about whether you need to have a red glaze that actually contains cadmium, or whether you can work with a cadmium-free glaze and it will do what you want it to do. If so, eliminate the carcinogenic cadmium compounds and work with a non-toxic glaze. Look for the word non-toxic on the label as an indicator that the glaze does not contain toxic heavy metals. So how can you protect yourself from toxic dust generated from the glazes that you're working with? There's three options. The first one is to work with a non-toxic glaze. If it's not toxic, then your worries about breathing in the dust automatically go down. And that's considered the first approach to take. If you really need to use a glaze powder that has a toxic constituent in, the second thing you can do is you can have an exhaust system set up, somewhat like the one we see here, that will suck any dust that's generated away. So if we opened up this copper compound down at the bottom of this, hopefully this is pulling hard enough that in the process of scooping out the dust, any excess dust molecules that are coming up off of the scoop that I'm taking will go up inside of this exhaust duct that we've got here. There's a fine balance. You want it to pull well enough that any random dust molecules or any vagrant dust motes are going to be pulled up, but it's not going to actually pull so hard that it's going to suck all of the powder out of the scoop that you've used. Quite often what we find is that these exhaust ducts are not pulling as well as they should. For about $80 online, you can buy an air velocity meter. And your goal is to find that it's pulling somewhere around about 100 feet per minute. That's a really nice exhaust rate that we should look for when we're buying one of those things. The farther you move your work area away from where that exhaust duct is located, the less efficient it will be. And in the case of this particular one, within a few inches, you're pulling at 100 feet per minute. By the time you move a foot away, we're pulling at about 20. And by the time we move 2 feet away, it's not having any effect whatsoever. So you don't want this to create a false sense of security. The final way you can protect yourself is by wearing a dust mask. And you want to have one that fits tightly, so it can't have just one strap. You want to have more than one strap. And look for the letter N with the number 95 after it. That 95 indicates that it pulls 95% of the particulates out of the air that you're breathing in. So that's a good safety measure to have. A combination of the dust, or the dust exhaust system, the local exhaust ductwork, along with the mask is the best way to go.